Hello, viewers. Welcome to our class Edu 411. And today we are going to look at the development of comparative education. Before we look at the development of comparative education, allow me to summarize one or two things that we looked at in our previous lesson. Now, we say that we are going comparative education will take 39 hours. And in our previous class, we looked at the purpose of the course, and we say that the main purpose of comparative education, as one of the areas in education, is to expose teacher trainees. And who are teacher trainees? You are the teacher trainees to the systems of education and issues, or if you don't want to say issues, you can say problems in education with a view of broadening their perspective on education problems and attempted solutions. I want to repeat that the main purpose as to why you, a teacher trainee, is studying comparative education is to expose you, a teacher trainee, to the study of systems of educations and issues, or if you don't want to say issues, problems in education with a view of broadening your understanding or your perspective on educational problems and educational solutions. So if you study problems facing education in Kenya, you should also try to look at nations have attempted to deal with the same problems or which may have occurred in their own countries. This is important because the knowledge of comparative education helps the teacher in policy formulation, analysis, and implementation. It enables educationists understand what is successful in the field of education policy from one country and use them in their own countries. We've really talked about the purpose of comparative education, and you need to know that. Unless you know that, then you'll be singing a song to a god or a sheep. So, what are the expected outcome? What are you supposed to know at the end of it all? What are you supposed to know? By the end of the semester, what are you supposed to know? So by the end of this course, the students, and who are students? You, the students, are supposed to be able to know the following. One, you are supposed to be in a position of stating the definition, the scope, aims, and the purpose of comparative education. Two, you are supposed to be in a position of explaining the justification of comparative education to student teachers. Three, you are supposed to be in a position of illustrating the development of comparative education. Four, you are supposed to be in a position of discussing the methodology in comparative education. You are also supposed to be in a position of comparing the system of education in Kenya with those of other nations. You will also be required to give a comparative analysis of contemporary in education. Now, before I embark on what I'm supposed to do, I want to give you a takeaway assignment. And those ones who will be able to do it should be able, those ones who will want us to rate them on the same should be able to liaise with the class representatives. So the first question is going to F3 group, class representative. You will choose for me the first three people to prepare on this and present in class on Wednesday when we meet between 5 and 7 this week. So I don't know if you are getting me. The class rep for F3, that is EDA, third group. The first people to come to you, make sure that you give them this question. This will be their takeaway assignment. Let them handle it, and they will have to present in class. And this is the question. State the definition of comparative education. That is number one, comparative education. And this definition should not be in less than 100 words. So your explanation must be more than 100 words because you will be presenting in class. B, what is the purpose of comparative education trainees? What is the purpose of comparative education to teacher trainees? And here you must give me how many. Here I will need sufficient comparative education. And among those ones, I want you to get me three. You must talk about the intellectual reasons. You must talk about planning. You must also talk about comparative education for practicability. You must talk about comparative education from humanitarian viewpoint. From humanitarian viewpoint, you must talk about seeing education in world perspective. Seeing education in world perspective. This point also needs to come out very well. Promotes innovation or promoting innovation in education. Promoting innovation in education. You must also talk about economics of education. Economics of education. Yes, I also want you to talk about education for international understanding. Education for international understanding. Don't leave those ones out. Remember, I've given you a summary. I've also taught you on the same, but I want you to do a very good work. Only a group of three will be given time to present. And this group, or this group of three must come from F3 as it will be decided by class rep. Class rep, don't give this question to more than one group. And a group of three, those ones will come to you first, give them, and we shall give them between 10 to 20 minutes to present their work in class, and we shall award them. Shall award them. Now, what about C2, class rep? C2, C2. C2, I'll give you a question. For that question, I think this is the question for C2. Hmm, C2, I'll give you the question towards the end of this lesson. So just be prepared for the question by the end of this session. So, allow me to move and talk about the development of education, development of comparative education. This is our second lecture. Whatever we have been handling was the first lecture. This is now the second lecture. In the second lecture, we are going to look at the development of comparative education. And from this, I'll give out an assignment to C2. So, In this lesson, we highlight the main phase through which comparative education has gone. We shall also describe the characteristic activities of each of the identified phases and apply the knowledge obtained in each phase to the current day setup of their own country. Can you think of where comparative education derives its knowledge? Just imagine, where does comparative education derive its knowledge? Did you mention something like geography, something like history, sociology, anthropology, political science, or philosophy? Have you mentioned anything of the sort? You could also know the scholars associated with the origin of comparative education. So, the present shape of comparative education, which has emerged out and is distinct from philosophy, sociology, and history. This is what I'm saying. Comparative education is not sociology, it's distinct, very different from sociology. Comparative education is different from history. It is neither philosophy nor economics. So, comparative education is not anthropology, it's very different. So, the present shape of comparative education, which has emerged out and is distinct from philosophy, distinct from sociology and history, economics of education, as part of the field of theory of education, has crystallized only in the 28th century. What am I saying? I'm saying that comparative education has been identified as a course or a field of study on its own in the 28th century. In the 28th century. So that is to say that before the 28th century, comparative education was being confused with these other courses. It was being confused with the sociology, history, economics, philosophy. But now, in the 28th century, uh, comparative education stands on its own as a field of study. It may not be possible to associate it with a specific discipline. It derives its knowledge from different disciplines. Those include history, sociology, anthropology, geography, political science, and philosophy. So, what are you supposed to get at the end of this lecture? By the end of this lesson, today's lesson, you should be able to highlight the main phases through which comparative education has gone through and its development. You should also be in a position of describing the main characteristics of comparative education, the main characteristics of comparative education. You should also be in a position of describing the main activities of each of the identified phases. You should be in a position to apply the knowledge obtained in this phase to the current day setup in their country. That is what you are supposed to know. So, the knowledge that you are going to learn today, you are supposed to use that knowledge and associate with what is happening in Kenya, especially during this implementation phase of CBC. Having said that, allow me now to move and talk about the phases in the development of comparative education. Phases in the development of comparative education. Now, the development of comparative education can be studied in seven major phases or stages that are based on the major characteristic activities. Let me come up again that the development of comparative education can be studied in seven major phases. How many phases? Seven major phases. The development of comparative education can be studied in how many phases? Seven major phases or stages. If you don't want to say phases of comparative education, you will say stages of comparative education based on major characteristic activities. So each phase is based on major characteristic activities. These phases are one, the phase of traveler's tales. The phase of traveler's tales. The phase of traveler's tales lasted between or from antiquity to 1817. When I say antiquity, it means from the origin, the beginning of man, from the beginning of man. When I talk about beginning of man, some of you will go to history, others will go to science, and still we have those of you who will refer to holy books such as the Bible and the Holy Quran to establish the origin of man. So what I'm saying is that the first phase, the so-called the traveler's tales, covers the period from antiquity to 1917. The second phase of the development of comparative education is what I'm going to refer to as the phase of pioneers. The phase of pioneers. This phase lasted between 1917 to 1900. It lasted between 1917 and 1817, sorry, from 1817 to 1900. At times, this phase is referred to as the phase of selective education borrowing, selective borrowing, or selective education borrowing. This is referred to as the phase of pioneers. The phase of pioneers can also be referred to as the phase of selective educational borrowing. What am I saying? The phase of pioneers can also be referred to as the phase of selective education borrowing. Selective education borrowing. We have the third phase, and you people will allow me talk about this third phase. This third phase is referred to as the phase of philosophers. The phase of philosophers. This phase of philosophers is concerned or is known to be concerned with cultural context. Cultural context. It deals with the concern for cultural context. We are saying that the phase of philosophers concerns itself with cultural context. Cultural context from the word culture, cultural context. It lasted from 1900 to the end of the Second World War in the year 1945. That the phase of philosophers lasted from 1900 to the end of the Second World War in the year 1945. The fourth phase is what we are going to refer to as the phase of social science perspective. The fourth phase is what we are going to refer to as the social science perspective. This one lasted from the end of the Second World War to present. It lasted from the end of the Second World War to present. That is, no, no, I've talked about the phase of philosophers, and that is the concern for cultural context. That one, we say that it lasted from 1900 to the end of the Second World War in 1945. And the fourth one, I've talked about the phase of social science perspective. The phase of social science perspective. This one lasted from the end of the Second World War to present. Lasted from the end of the Second World War to present. The fifth stage, the fifth stage is what we are going to refer to as the phase of heterodoxy. Heterodoxy. The phase of heterodoxy. And this one is referred to as the paradigm wars. Paradigm wars. Paradigm wars. The sixth one is what I'm going to refer to as the phase of heterogeneity. Heterogeneity. The phase of heterogeneity. We are referring to it, the sixth one, we are referring to that phase as the phase of heterogeneity. And lastly, allow me mention the last area. This is the contemporary trends. The contemporary trends. Now, having given you the highlights of the phases in the development of comparative education, I now come back to C2. I come back to C2, the C2 uh, class rep for C2. I hope you are there, you are ready. And this one, you will also identify three people or three members in your group. Those ones will come to you first. You'll give them this assignment. These are the people who will attempt this assignment. And this is the assignment that I'm going to give them. They'll present in class. They will discuss the assignment in class on Wednesday. We shall also give them between 10 to 15 minutes to present this work. And this question is discuss the three, discuss the phases, discuss the phases involved in the development of comparative education. Discuss the phases involved in the development of comparative education. Discuss the phases involved in the development of comparative education. Now, another question, and this one you will give to group 2, that is C2 group 2, the next group that will come to you. And a group should not be more than, should not be made up of more than 3 members. And remember, we shall be marking live in class. So this was the second one, give them this. That describe the phase of pioneers. This is the second group. Discuss the phase of pioneers. The so-called selective education borrowing. Now, another group, give them this. Discuss the contribution, describe the contribution of Xenophon. Xenophon. And let me give you the spellings of Xenophon. No, this is a Greek name. That is Xenophon. Xenophon. to discuss the contribution of Xenophon. And Xenophon existed between this period, between BC 430 and BC 355. BC 430 and BC 355. So discuss the contribution of uh, Xenophas to the development of comparative education. That is the third group. Now these are three groups in C2. What about F3? I'm coming back to F3. Class rep. Remember, I gave you the question for the first group. What about the second and third group? For the second group, you will give them this question. Explain the present day. Explain the present day example of selective education borrowing. Ex- Explain the present day examples of selective education borrowing. Explain the present day example of selective education borrowing. That is the question for group two. What about group three? Group three, I have a question for you. Group three, F3. You'll give them this question. Discuss the three phases involved in comparative education. Discuss the three phases involved in the development of comparative education. Discuss the three phases, any three phases involved in the development of comparative education. I think I want to amend the question for group 1C2. We cannot just leave it like that. I think you will also deal with only three phases. You cannot deal with all the eight phases, only discuss three phases. Now, if you don't have anything to say, I want to promise you that more information on those assignments that I've given you will be discussed in tomorrow's lesson through the YouTube channel. So I'll discuss those things in details, and those who are handling those areas, be sure I'll really assist you. Tomorrow's lesson will really assist you so that you get the in-depth information as regards the development of comparative education. That is lecture two. So it means that tomorrow we are going to build on what we have said today. We shall expound on it so that you get a real grasp or a firm grasp on what you are supposed to have as regards the development of comparative education. Now, I also want to advise you to subscribe to this YouTube channel so that anything that I post, you will be notified in time. You don't wait to be told by the class rep that we have this and this information, but you will be notified. So be sure that if you subscribe to this YouTube channel, you will always be notified. You'll be the first person to be notified whenever new information or whenever we have a class. Don't wait for the class rep to inform you or to be informing you that we have a class on an online class. Make sure that you just subscribe so that you will be notified. You'll be receiving this notification that we have something new on our new YouTube channel. Um, so far, so good. You are good students, and I think I'm in love with this class. Whatever you are doing, I've seen some serious work from some people, some quarters in this class, and I'm very happy. And that is why I promised that I'll mentor some people from this class, and I want them to be serious scholars because I've seen them do very serious work. Thank you. Greet your babies. Have a nice supper. Bye.